Okay. Thank you, Philip, for this wonderful journey and trip on so many levels into a, like Syrian landscape and liberated zones in Syria, as well as into a history or like an archive of a cinematic archive, and a history of the so-called Bilad al-Sham, or the Fertile Crescent, known as the Fertile Crescent. I think you weave all these different dimensions wonderfully together. And the connection between nation-state building and private property becomes more and more articulated throughout. But in order to build on the previous conversation, I would like to start by referencing someone you also return to in your film, and that is Omar Aziz, the Syrian revolutionary and anarchist that left us an amazing text, actually, that is called The Formation of the Local Councils. And it's a detailed text on organizing, actually, how to organize, autonomous zones, and from his experience in the Syrian Revolution of 2011 in the liberated zones. So I think that we have a sort of almost like a duty to, and as you do it also in your film, to remember Omar Aziz, and also to remember this kind of a letter that he left behind him. Of course, Omar Aziz was kidnapped by the regime forces and tortured and killed. And the so-called experiment of the local councils and the liberated zones is a short-lived experiment. But indeed, it has happened. And it brings us back to a possibility of, a living in a self-governed manner outside of a state structure, right? So it brings us back, and through your film, you brought us back to that moment in 2011, and also to that possibility that you also, that echoes the kind of like the Ottoman space, or like the pre-nation state formation. And I think Omar Aziz and his texts really carry this, what Ruthie was also talking about, how to give form to organization, and how this can actually, in a rehearsal process, lead to abolition. So perhaps we would be good to start from there with Omar Aziz, and how he comes into the film, and how his voice also comes in the film. Again, how Kay's voice guides us through, but also guides us through, multiple voices as well.
It's very special to show this film in this setting. I'm very honored to show it here. There's a bit of an irony with Omar Aziz, that his kind of nom de guerre, his pseudonym that he was going by was Abu Kamil. And in my research, I found that in an earlier period of similar kind of experimenting of local governance, let's say, they weren't local councils, between the First and Second World War, there was also a character whose name was Kamil, who was at the lead of this experiment. And for me, it's a little bit of a, it's an example of something that I found very well described by a historian called Richard Steitz, who talks about psychic mechanisms. In his research in the Russian Revolution, he found that a lot of the places that were where the strongest resistance took place in 1917 were also some of the places where the strongest struggles had been led previously in the past, that had been crushed. But he refers to these psychic mechanisms like some kind of seeds that remain in place from these previous struggles. And this is, I think, something that a lot of Syrians don't know about, actually, because it's not a part of the national narrative, this experiment, this kind of extra state experiment of leading a community differently. So yeah, Omar Aziz is somebody who early on, so he wrote kind of two papers, one at the end of 2011 and then a kind of revised version in 2012 before he was kidnapped, because he saw these protests taking place first in Damascus and then spreading out all over the country. But he was concerned that these protests would just remain in this kind of realm of opposition. And he saw the need to start thinking ahead to what kind of structures could be put in their place. And from having talked to a lot of activists, I mean, I worked on this film for 5 years, and I did quite a lot of research with people also from different parts of the country. Even though Omar Aziz wasn't around for very long, these papers that he wrote really inspired a lot of these different, also very different, you know, they didn't work as well every time, and they weren't always as radical. I mean, we shouldn't also just kind of romanticize the whole experiment, but they were an extremely important element of the Syrian Revolution that very quickly has gotten covered over by images of civil war and a refugee crisis. But to me, what happened in Syria is some of the most radical experiments in the region in our recent history by far.
I don't know if you would like to talk about Kay at all, and also about the footage itself. So, yeah, I mean, we see at the end in the credits the S as the initial of the cinematographer, but perhaps you would like to say something about that, the footage, and also Kay. So.
I mean, there's a lot to say. I can start with Kay. So as I was starting to work on this film and looking for someone who would take this journey, I experimented with different characters. And Kay is somebody that I came across that is a real person. Her name was Kulthum Mauda. She was a nurse from, initially actually she was a school teacher from a village near Nazareth. And she married a Russian school teacher. And this was her way of leaving the country and getting further education, actually. So she went to Russia, where she was a volunteer nurse during the First World War, and then she joined the Russian Revolution. And then she traveled back to Palestine in the 30s. So I kind of, I use her as a vessel. The facts are altered. But I use her as a vessel because a lot of this kind of travel writing that we know is purely colonial. Most of the record that we have of people traveling to these lands are explorers that are going to take something. And I wanted to find someone who was going to participate. So yeah, I mean, to me, this is a kind of a very important role that she plays in making this journey possible. The images, I mean, there's so much to say, but I mean, there was many beginnings to this film, and one of them is from this character S, who didn't want his name known, who is an Egyptian who traveled to Syria 3 times. We see them crossing the kind of the fence at a period from Turkey into Syria at a period where this was still possible. And they filmed, they took a lot of footage because they wanted this story told, but they were actually not going to film for a film. They were going to, as a form of solidarity, to hear, to witness what was taking place, to see how they could be supportive. And then they just wanted this footage used if it could be used. And I didn't shoot a single shot for this film. It's all, I mean, clearly there's a lot of archival material and excerpts from fiction films, but also all the footage from Syria is, they're things that either S filmed or I collected from friends and friends of friends. So for example, the footage that you see of these kinds of the sun oven, this was used as a kind of tutorial, but it was shared only in closed Facebook groups amongst these different local councils. So this was a period when the Assad regime had cut off the energy from an area on the outskirts of Damascus, and they had to come up with ways of survival, which was so much of what these local councils were about. I mean, they had to reform how they were going to run a school because they weren't going to keep teaching the regime's curriculum. So they would actually like tear out parts of the curriculum that they wouldn't teach and then add new lessons. Similarly with the clinics, I mean, really, they had very intricate systems set up to dig new wells when the regime purposefully bombed other wells. There's a lot of work also on agriculture, a lot of seeds that were being smuggled into the liberated zones in Syria, because Syria had been set up in a very centralized manner. So everything was determined by the central state and also bought by the central state. And so, you know, farmers were not ready for this kind of situation where they needed to create their own internal system. So, yeah, this is all a part of that very radical experiment. Yeah.
I would like to ask the audience if there are any questions or comments or, I don't know, clarifications for Philip. I mean, it's pretty late, so perhaps we just, you know, open it up already. Or take a minute to think about a question or formulate something if you would like. While I asked Philip about this. Yeah, I mean, that question of the image, right? As private property, mapping, surveying the land is so, you know, bound to image making as well. And the archive you use is so diverse as well. So I would like to, I would like you to talk more about this archive, how it has been, you know, like configured, why these particular films, you know, from like Soviet films to a kind of 100 faces in a single day. So yeah, like why this configuration?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I worked on this for a long time, but also it's kind of a lifetime of watching films that fed into the possibility of this film. And for me, there's two ways of relating to images in this film for me. So you have the kind of, you have footage from colonial archives, which I steal because I don't, because the intention that went into their taking of that footage, for example, you have this aerial footage. This comes from a German archive, because prior to the end of the First World War, the Germans were very certain that they were the ones who would inherit the Ottoman Empire. Inherit as in take it. They lost. But the intention of this, the gaze was, you know, it's the desire for this land. They thought they deserved it. They had closer economic ties with the Ottoman Empire. They had already built a lot of infrastructure there. And so they were preparing for the colonization of the Ottoman Empire. And so in using that footage, I don't ask them for permission, because it's taking back what they intended to take. With a lot of the kind of more political films, to me, I mean, it's a form of citation that I think is a pre-copyright kind of mentality. In Islamic literature, for example, you would often have writers cite other authors as a form of respect. And so it was never seen as a form of theft. There was no principle of footnotes or citation or references, but the people who read the texts knew where the other texts came from. And for me, there's a similar process taking place where if I'm using Peter Watkins' footage from La Commune, for example, to me it is a form of showing respect for that work and that experience. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more I can say about footage, but that's the kind of the mentality that went into the selection process of the footage. Yeah.
So 2 questions.
Test it. That one.
Hello?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this film. I absolutely enjoyed it. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but it was really something. I have very teeny tiny kind of thought that was kind of in my head about the kind of linearity of all of this. Especially at the end, we have this like precise mapping of with the years, with the locations, with the events and all of that. And I was just thinking, why this linearity? Maybe it's obvious why, but I just kind of came back to the question in my head. And is there anything lost in that linearity and choosing this particular sequentiality of these events?
Firstly, sorry there was some Spanish in there that wasn't supposed to be in there. That I wasn't testing your Spanish skills. Just a mistake. So the last time I screened this in Beirut, someone made a comment about this timeline, and they said that this was for them like the worst part of the film because they really, they didn't want this kind of like timeline and explanation. And then someone on the other side of the room said they were so relieved that it was there because it, helped them put some pieces together. So it's always a part of the film that I felt uncomfortable about because, yeah, I don't want to do this kind of too much explaining. But I also don't find that it's a complete timeline at all. I mean, it's very selective. And so it's just kind of like putting some of the pieces together after the fact. Because it was a big struggle making this film and not explaining things. Like I didn't want to explain. I wanted it to be an experiential film, So there's a lot of things that are probably get lost, and a lot of references, you might not be familiar with the different films that it's referencing. I mean, there's so much that I could talk about in this film. And so I felt like I needed to give some keys at the end of why I was piecing things together the way that I was. But yeah, it's not it's not a perfect solution, you know. But yeah, thanks for this small comment. Lama.
I will say something really quickly because it was kind of connected actually. I think we spoke about this a lot today also in the working sessions. To be honest, I really like the map at the end, like the kind of sequence. I think because of this use of because there's this iconography you develop, no, like the kind of suppression by force returns as this kind of soldier figures. No, there's this repetitiveness that actually I read much more like a cyclical temporality than a linear one. I just think that I wonder if, you know, within the cycle of revolution, what's the word? Suppression, revolution, suppression, revolution, suppression. If the local council or the commune or whatever word we want to give it doesn't in fact like dislodge itself from this cycle, you know, or if it's not within that same temporality. And I feel like actually that's kind of, for me, Omar Aziz's work was also about kind of saying that this temporality of we revolt and we're killed, we revolt and we're killed, demands that we kind of exit out of that time to a time of the commune. And that I feel actually in this sequence, for me, the commune is kind of a line under all of it all the time or something like that. It's just a comment, but yeah, it's also connected.
Thanks.
I also had a comment/question. But building off of Lama, I think the cycle also has to do with the session we're talking about, which is dreaming, falling, and doing all at the same time. And I think when we speak of the Syrian Revolution specifically, it's one that is very heavy and also very misunderstood in the Arab consciousness. So I think that having the process narrated in a way in which we can continue to remember these, you know, this failing and this dreaming and this doing all at the same time as a process of continuation, of a rehearsal, of doing it over and over and over again until it ends up working, because it must and it has to. And I think we see that, you know, seeping in. Like I'm not sure if anyone has this, but also in my feed, for example, when we're going through what we're going through with Palestine, I think the Syrian archive keeps coming up as examples to what had happened, like how the protests were organized and the different tactics and strategies that were being utilized. And I think that there is this reference and resource and archive that we have from past experiences that become so, yeah, saturated by these images that we're talking about, that we don't necessarily look at the images that, you know, need to be looked at, like the fence or the rope or the crossing and these kind of symbols and the potentiality of actually breaking them. I don't know why this sound is happening. Yeah, I don't know if it's a question, but it's more, yeah, I'm just wondering now when you're thinking of this film today, I'm just curious what comes to mind or what you think is important to articulate.
I mean, your comment makes me think of about somewhere about halfway through the process of working on the film, I think it was the end of 2017, someone who was very close to the Syrian struggle asked me, like, why are you doing this now? You know, when things were already really heading into a bad place and a lot of people had left the country and a lot of these experiments had closed, you know, had been crushed and people had fled when they could. And to me, it's you know, I started working on this film when the Egyptian Revolution had also been had come to an end. At least it was in a downward spiral. It depends on how we define the word revolution, because I think the word thawra has the Arabic term for revolution gives us a lot in that it doesn't reference this kind of overturning of a system. It's actually much more of the spirit of revolution rather than, you know, a system being replaced with a different system. But yeah, what I'd done a lot of, and this is something Yasmina and I had kind of had realized that a lot of time when we were filming during the Egyptian Revolution, our gaze was backwards. You know, we were looking at what had happened or recording something as it was happening and then showing it later in order to either counter the propaganda of the state to give a different narrative of, you know, how we experienced the street, or, you know, we made a lot of short films of like worker strikes or occupations in factories. It was often this kind of testimony. And what I wanted to try and do with this film was to have a gaze forward. So it wasn't at all about documenting something that had happened in Syria. Like, those films exist. But I was tired of this role of, I don't know, reporting or explaining, or, you know, I wanted to do something with the image that would provoke, that would inspire thinking forward rather than looking back at what took place. And this is why, you know, like there are elements of this that are not, it's not about being like close to facts necessarily. You know, it's about the spirit of the moment and trying to engage that for a different moment. And so I find it very important to show this film now, because it's not about, this is not a film about the Syrian Revolution. It was never meant to be. When I first started, but it quickly changed, you know, as I also draw these parallels with other struggles that are way further in history. I'm also not trying to capture those struggles. I'm trying to get at a certain spirit of them. And this is something that we will constantly need again and again. And I think it's more to provoke a conversation, to provoke a kind of energy that we need and we continue to seep like energy from in order to continue our struggles. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thanks to everyone for staying.